Americans are focusing a lot more attention on China these days, especially because of that country's role in the COVID-19 pandemic. Part of the conversation involves a reevaluation of American trade relationships with China. Our next guest has researched the topic, and his work challenges a popular narrative about American-Chinese trade. Scott Lincicome is a senior fellow in economic studies with the libertarian Cato Institute. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me. Good to be back.
One of the reasons why you put together this piece is this narrative that has grown at least in recent months, if not years, that the American trade relationship with China has been bad for America. First of all, before you counter it, what is the basis of this narrative?
Right. So it seems that you really can't read the newspaper or hear about a new policy proposal without it being in some way oftentimes tied to this narrative. And the idea is that in the late 1990s, the Clinton administration and Congress got together and passed a law, Permanent Normal Trade Relations, essentially allowing China to enter the World Trade Organization. And that, in turn, spurred what we call the China shock, which was a substantial increase in imports of Chinese goods into the United States that, so the studies go, destroyed approximately 2.5 million jobs. Now, that also is that PNTR and China's WTO accession, along with the China shock, is also blamed for fueling the rise of China and China's shift towards a liberalism and empire and all of the bad things we hear about the Chinese government doing these days. And again, all of that is tied not to the regime in Beijing, but instead the fingers are pointed back at policymakers several decades ago.
Now, you put this to the test in a policy analysis for Cato labeled Testing the China Shock, and you find that the story is not quite what this narrative says.
No, and there are several misconceptions, and really that make the narrative complex, to put it nicely. Really, the number of flaws in the narrative I just gave to collectively prove pretty fatal for the thesis. And the first is just simply the narrative of permanent normal trade relations and China's WTO accession. It is cast as if the United States flipped a switch and suddenly China joined the WTO. Nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is that China exceeded the WTO over about a 15-year period. There were all sorts of multilateral negotiations, bilateral negotiations between the United States and China. The United States drove the hardest bargain of any of the WTO member countries, and they've made China agree to all sorts of things that no other WTO member had to agree to. At the same time, PNTR, that vote in Congress, was actually simply the making permanent, something that the United States had been granting on an annual basis for over 20 years. And that was actually done not out of any grand desire or belief that China would suddenly become a liberal democracy, but instead was really a basic pragmatic decision. Every other WTO member had granted China that status. If the United States hadn't done the same, United States companies would have lost out on the Chinese market. The United States would have lacked a venue, the World Trade Organization, to press its interests. And China still would have risen anyway. And that's, I think, a big point and something that people miss, is that counterfactual that somehow if the United States had denied PNTR, China would not be causing problems today, is simply just is belied by the facts. The second big problem is economic. If you actually look at multiple studies that have been published since the original China shock literature, you see a lot of things that really, again, cast doubt on this China shock narrative. The first, and I think the most important, is that China's WTO accession and U.S. economic engagement with China actually brought a ton of benefits for the United States. Of course, there are consumer benefits, whether it's cheap T-shirts or consumer electronics and all of that, estimated to total hundreds of dollars per year per person for the rest of our lives. So it can be a good chunk of money in terms of consumer benefits. But it's not just consumer benefits. There are studies showing really substantial gains for American companies, American manufacturers that ended up importing inputs that they use, and of course their workers use, to make their own globally competitive products. There's also literature showing that there were substantial pro-competitive effects in terms of innovation in the United States, that many of the jobs we lost in manufacturing, we gained back in services or in other types of manufacturing. So you put all of this together and you see that the China shock is really far more complex and more benign than, again, this kind of scary narrative you hear.
We're chatting with Scott Lincicome. He is Senior Fellow in Economic Studies with the libertarian Cato Institute. Some people might hear us and say, wait a minute, it sounds like he doesn't recognize that China is this bad guy.
Yeah.
You're not saying that China is this great nation and we should be thankful that we have any relations with them.
No, definitely not. And in fact, I think it's undeniable that particularly in the last decade, the Chinese government has really taken a turn for the worse. And not simply in terms of human rights and trade, but foreign policy, censorship and the rest. But in order to actually address those issues, it's really critical for us to understand what the United States did right and what the United States did wrong in the last 20 years. And that's really the point of my paper. It grew out of a frustration that American policymakers routinely pointed at a singular event, PNTR, China's WTO accession, and at economic engagement more broadly, and said, aha, there is our mistake. So clearly we can solve this by just shutting off trade with China. And the fact is that's really just not true. That, again, China would have risen in the absence of U.S. economic engagement. And, by the way, there are tons of actual policy mistakes that the United States government did in the wake of China's WTO accession. So in other words, in the last 20 years. And I list a lot of these in the piece. I mean, one of the most basic ones is that the United States failed to bring a lot of WTO disputes. So the World Trade Organization has this rather successful dispute settlement system where countries can bring cases against each other, essentially like a court. And the facts show that China actually has done a decent job in terms of compliance. Certainly not perfect. No nation is perfect. But when they are pressed on the issue due to reputational issues and they're valuing the WTO itself, the Chinese government will change their behavior. Unfortunately, the United States has only brought a handful of cases, and even when the United States has won, they didn't actually go further and demand compliance. That's a problem. Other problems outside of the trade space are, look, we had for decades a very uncompetitive corporate tax rate. We have all sorts of labor policies and other regulations that really have stymied American companies and workers. And oh, by the way, we ditched an agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was actually designed to help contain China's economic rise and to provide countries like Japan and Vietnam and others another outlet. So they didn't have to depend on China. They could depend more on the United States. All of those things we ignored, and instead, again, our policymakers point the finger at back 20 years ago at PNTR.
You allude to this, but it sounds as if one of the major reasons for writing this piece is to say, look, let's not abandon free trade and liberalized trade policies. Right. They are not the problem.
Yeah, and I think that's another big problem that I have with a lot of the China shock debate, is that policymakers and pundits want to draw broader lessons from the China experience and apply those to other countries, as if, well, we got China so wrong, now we need to be protectionist with countries other than China, or we need to engage in all sorts of mercantilism or industrial policy and the rest. And so that, of course, does multiple problems. I mean, the first is that China aside, we have tons of experience with protectionism and economic nationalism, and it's routinely shown to impose immense costs on American workers and consumers, to fail to achieve its actual objectives, whether it's protecting American companies or trying to achieve gains in foreign policy, you name it. And, oh, by the way, it also breeds all sorts of corruption and cronyism. There's a reason right now that K Street is booming in the wake of a lot of Trumpian protectionist policies. Right. So, and then the other thing is that China is, in many senses, a very unique thing. This was a nuclear power with over 1 billion citizens, consumers, a billion people. And denying China access to the WTO was simply not really a realistic option. And the effects that Chinese rapid modernization, coming after, of course, decades and decades of communist rule and poverty that associated with it, that is all just a unique one-time event. So trying to draw broader lessons about economic engagement and applying those to new countries, for example, Vietnam or something like that, or India, really will cause more harm than good by far.
So in the remaining moments that we have, if people are trying to think of, all right, what should be our proper response to China moving forward? Sure. What do you recommend?
Well, I think, again, to visit some of the things I just said, it's a start to have a more competitive corporate tax rate. It's very important to maintain competitive regulatory space, to maintain open and free immigration in terms of maintaining a really competitive and vibrant sector, and especially in things like high tech. But equally important are a lot of these trade issues. Rejoining the TPP or some form of that would be a critical improvement. Again, to provide an alternative to China's kind of gravitational pull in the Asia-Pacific region. And again, engagement at the WTO, using what we know actually works. And that would be a far more aggressive use of dispute settlement. And then finally, certainly, American sanctions need to be part of the mixture here. That it is important to sanction specific individuals and actors that have pushed whether it's human rights violations or the rest. We have a pretty robust sanctions policy that can do that. But that's really different from these kind of broad-based tariffs that end up actually hurting American companies and consumers and, quite frankly, create an environment of economic isolation that could lead to not just a trade war, but a real war.